Welcome to the second session of Bringing Bias in from the Cold. I'm Bron Williams. My first guest today is the wonderful Ruchi Singh from India. Ruchi has a wisdom born from many various experiences in her life, one of which was the amazing opportunity to speak at the United Nations and bring a keynote there. My second guest is David Neal. David, like me, is from Australia, but we have vastly different life experiences. David spent many years in the military, and he brings that experience and the understanding and wisdom gained into his leadership coaching business. It was from David that I learned something new about bias. See if you can find out what it is. My third guest is Sue Tiong from Malaysia. Sue and I met on the other side of the world in the United States when we were at a speaking conference together, and we randomly sat next to each other. So often it is those random events in life that really do bring people together and build bonds, and I know you will learn a lot from Sue. So enjoy listening to Ruchi, David and Sue.
I'm Bronwyn Williams, the bias expert, and this is Bringing Bias in from the Cold. Today's guest is Ruchi Singh from India. How are you, Ruchi?
Hi, Bron. I'm good. I'm so happy to be talking to you.
It's wonderful to talk with you as well. So, Ruchi, could you tell us more about yourself and what you do, please?
All right. So I'm a lot of things actually. Earlier, it was easy for me to say I'm heading talent management for a company, but now I am a storyteller. I'm an international keynote speaker. In fact, I was very lucky to get an opportunity this year itself to give a keynote at the United Nations, and I was lucky because I gave that speech, and after that, the world went into a lockdown. I had nothing to do with it, and and I'm a personal leadership and communication mentor, and I'm writing 2 books. So yeah, very soon I can add author to it.
Excellent. Oh, wow. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about this time in the world's history is that we do get the chance to reinvent ourselves, to create the life that we want and not be limited by perhaps the things that people have thought we should do or our culture has told us to do, maybe limited by some of the biases. So
Yes.
What would you say bias is? How would you define it?
All right. Everything sounds, much more easier to retain if we give examples.
Yes.
So let me start with one word in German. It's called Untermensch, which means subhuman. And this bias of Hitler led to 6 million Jews dying during Nazi Germany. That's bias. Martin Luther King gave the historic speech, I Have a Dream. And in that, he talked about, I have a dream that one day this nation would rise up to the true meaning of its creed. And like that, everyone is equal. And it's been 57 years since that historic speech. And we need a Black Lives Matters movement. That's bias.
Yes.
And Bron, you'll be very surprised that a UN report as recent as this year has said that close to 90% men and women hold some kind of bias against women. In fact, there's this common myth, girls don't help each other, but you and I, we both know it's a myth. We do help each other.
We do.
So, yeah, so that's bias, when we have an unreasonable leaning towards or against something individually or as a society, which has a very inverse impact on the person or the group of people we are biased against.
Yes.
I mean, that's bias to me.
Mm. And look, that, I think that sums it up beautifully. And thank you for those examples, some of them from history and some of them, you know, right up to date, because it's whether it's Hitler's attitude to Jews or white people's attitude to people of color, or, because I know India and China are not always happy about each other, whether it's national bias, you know, one nation against another.
Yes.
Our biases can get in the way, can't they?
Oh yes, oh yes. And history, we should always look back to history, because that's the best teacher. The kind of damage bias has done all through the ages is shocking. And what's more shocking is that we have somehow ignored it, like, no, it doesn't exist, let's carry on. So yeah.
Yeah, I know here in Australia, where white people are really only in the last 5 or 10 years starting to come to grips with the impact of white settlement in Australia, like really come to grips with what we have done. Maybe not us individually, but us as a culture have done to our
Yes.
Indigenous people. And we talk about casual racism, where
Yes.
we don't even think about it. It, you know, comments roll off the tongue, or attitudes
Yes.
are displayed. So in India, I know that India has, or it certainly historically had, a very strong caste system. Now that would play into bias, wouldn't it?
Yes, of course. Like I said, anything which which makes people lean towards or against something which has an adverse impact is a bias. In fact, it's funny. I had a bias against Australia.
Is that right?
Yes, let me tell you why. If you remember, a few years back, like there were a lot of anti-Indian feeling in Australia, right? And it was covered widely by the Indian media. And then both
Okay.
the governments came together and they did a lot of concerts and all. So when I had to move to Sydney, I was so scared. I had this fear
Oh,
that,
wow.
in fact, that's how, thing is. Like, I was scared even while going through the immigration. And Australian immigration people, they are scary. They're supposed to be. I mean,
Yeah.
they are supposed to be. But I was all the time scared that, okay, now maybe someone will say, hey, you are an Indian, you go back. What are you doing in my
Oh,
country?
wow.
And I was so scared. But um, my parents actually, they told me, they said, since I come from an army background and every 2 years we move. So obviously when we move, whole new set of people,
Yes.
and India is a very culturally rich country. So every culture has its own very strong identity. So they told me, like in India also, whenever we have moved from station to station, you have met people and you know that some people are nice, some people are not nice. So they told me, don't be biased against Australians. Remember that, the same thing will happen. There'll be some nice people and there'll be some bad people. And I'm so glad that I had a lovely experience with Aussies, Aussie, Aussie, Aussie.
Hey, oi, oi, oi. And that's good, because I think it's important to have a look at our own biases. And I know I've shared with you about confronting my own when I worked with asylum seekers in Nauru,
Yes.
because it's when we are courageous enough to confront our own biases, or allow them to be seen, that we can then actually go on and have a much richer and fuller experience of the situation in which we find ourselves. For me, it was being able to work within a multicultural team and learn so much from people who were not like me. And for you, being able to say, okay, I'm just going to put my bias on hold, I'm aware of it. And by doing that, you were then able to have a very rich experience, by and large, of your time here in Australia.
Yes, yes. Australia will always have a very deep impact in my life. I met some wonderful people, brilliant people. People I was worried about. They were very nice, very accepting, very loving to me. And at the same time, I went through domestic violence in Sydney.
Yes.
Yeah, and both you and I, being survivors,
Yep.
we face our own, biases from other people.
Yes.
So I went through that also.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because that's a very interesting point, because people who do experience domestic violence, or like in the Me Too movement, harassment and sexual abuse from people in power, it's that sense of being believed. And people have a bias against the victim and towards the perpetrator. And that is a very interesting dynamic within our society. And I think that's got to do a little with a bias against women. And I'm not here to bash men, because you and I both are not into that. But it's about actually taking a clear look and saying, well, actually, there is a bias towards men and away from women. Doesn't matter which culture you're in, whether it's Indian or Australian. And that sense of having to really prove to authorities, prove to friends and family that this is actually a serious situation. We have to work against a bias there.
Yes, and it is very traumatic. Like I was invited to give a keynote on domestic violence in Ghana, and there I mentioned one thing. Domestic violence victims, or victims of any crime for that matter, especially women, go through two kinds of violence. One is the violence itself, and the second violence is victim bashing.
Yes.
Yes, like when you asked, what did you do? I mean, the shock that I have, like, if I do something, does that justify being physically or mentally harassed? Like, there are certain situations where violence is okay. And it is, right now I can handle it well, but when you're going through it, it can shatter you to pieces.
Yes.
And yes, so victim bashing, whether it's domestic violence or racism or rape or any kind of crime, is a bias of a horrible, horrible type.
Yes. And I think you're right that, and sometimes that the latter one, the victim bashing, having to explain yourself, justify why you're making a complaint, face up against well, why didn't you say something earlier? Or it really wasn't that bad. And I know you've had those comments made to you about your situation. It's that sense in which we can't take people at face value. And I think that's one of the things that bias prevents us from doing, because we make prejudgments, don't we, around what we think happened, how we think people should behave. Yeah. I've long thought that word should would be best taken out of the English language because there's a sense in which should represents bias. It's when we say something should be like this, or that person should have done that, or I should have done this, or they should have, fill in all the blanks that you like. And that, when we hear those words, when we hear that word, I actually think that's a key for us to listen even more carefully to ourselves or to the other person who's speaking and saying, is this person, am I displaying some bias? Is that word should an indicator that the next thing that is going to be said has some bias attached to it?
Yes, that's a brilliant point of view, Bron. I'll be honest, I never thought like that, but now I'm thinking that maybe it is like a judgment word. You should do this. You should not have done it. Why did you stay? I would have done this.
Yes. That's right. Oh, it's such a complex world. And one of the things that I love about the conversations that I've done around bias is that I discover things. And that idea of should, that has actually only come out of this conversation. So thank you. You have played a part in my understanding deepening. And that's one of the things that I love. I'm convinced, actually I'll share a little comment that I put up on LinkedIn just recently, thinking that sometimes the world just gets a little bit serious, and talking about bias gets a little bit serious. And went searching the internet for a nice little cartoon, and there's a cartoon of the blue genie, like out of Aladdin, with a little dog, and the genie is saying to the dog, eradicating bias, that's a bit hard. Can we go for world peace instead? And, but I think what it did was provide a bit of a laugh, but it also highlights the fact that bias is here to stay. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think in some form or other, I think there will be biases, but what we should do is sometimes we cannot change the whole world, but the only thing we can change is about us.
Yes.
So, and that has a very deep impact on the world as a whole, right? Like, and these people like Mahatma Gandhi, when he stood against the mighty but very oppressive British Empire, and he said, this is not on, but I'll do it through non-violence.
Yes.
He took that step, and then the whole movement rallied around him. Same with Martin Luther King, same with Nelson Mandela. Like, he, after 27 years being in prison, what did he say? That I left two things behind in the prison: bitterness, and I think it was anger against his prisoners. Can you imagine doing that, like 27 years and you do that? But he said, yeah, and it's like, but he said that if I had not left that behind, I would still be in a prison. So he did that individually, but look at him. He has inspired us. We are talking about it. I talked about these things in my UN speech. And even when I was saying it, obviously I had written it, so I knew what I'm going to say. I was in awe of it. I could never be blessed about it. And that is the power of one. So you doing this is adding value. We may not eradicate bias totally, but we are having intelligent conversations. And even if it impacts one life positively, that's a huge progress.
It certainly is. And I, growing up in Christian tradition, we sang songs at Sunday school. And one of my favourites had the line that said, you in your small corner and I in mine. And I think I've taken that little line with me through my whole life, because particularly as you get older, you realise you're not going to change the world, but you can influence the part of the world that you get to inhabit. And particularly now with the global reach that Zoom and other internet platforms allow you to have, you actually do get to influence a much larger part of the world than you had previously.
Oh yes, I love internet. I love internet. That's the best thing which has happened, best invention which has happened recently.
Well, it means you can sit in India and I can sit in Australia and we can have a real-time conversation.
Yes, and we are actually in corners. We can't see it, but we are in a prettified corners.
That's correct. That's correct. So, Ruchi, what would you say is a good way to combat bias? Like, if we can't actually eliminate it because it starts so young and it comes out of our culture, whichever culture that happens to be, how can we combat it? How can we work against it or work with it?
See, I think one thing is we get to fear others less.
Yes.
We have to give others a chance, get to know them, and get to know them without any agenda. just getting to know people. Because if you have an agenda, then you're always thinking, okay, when do I make that pitch? But if you're just talking, conversing, like in my case, I told you, like I was so scared of coming to Australia, and Aussies are very lovely people. I had a wonderful experience, but for that I had to let go of my fear and give a chance to others to, let me understand that some people are good, some people are bad, but then that's universal.
It is.
Right? So that is there. Then education system can play a very important role.
Yes.
If, very smartly, because kids, we have to deal with them in a certain manner through stories and all. If we share stories of people from different cultures, different part of the world, religion, but as stories, then it becomes a part of their whole culture.
Yes.
Growing up, so they are familiar with maybe teachings of Buddha and Jesus Christ and Muhammad, like and it is so when we grow up with that kind of influence, and then someone comes and say, hey, that religion is bad, or that race is bad, or people who are this color are nicer or worse or whatever, you also think that no, maybe that's not true.
Yes.
And education has to play a very important role, and media.
Yes.
Like, it's high time that, in Hollywood, they stop showing Indians as just cab drivers. Seriously, we are in very high places. Like we are in World Bank.
Cab drivers and IT professionals.
Yes. And with that awful accent. See, we have an accent because everyone has an accent.
That's right.
And it may not be as cool as Aussie, but come on, we don't, like, all of us don't talk in that manner. So media has to do, we are not always doing this. It's like, I've had that so many times. Like, Indian, oh yeah, it's like, seriously, dude.
I know, it's really, and they're the things, like, you understand why we use stereotypes in storytelling, because it helps people to identify. But you're quite correct, because even as though you might say that Aussies are cooler with their accents, but we can be stereotyped as well, wearing the Akubra hat and, the big knife.
No worries.
No worries, g'day, mate. All of those things, I think it's when, and some stereotyping is funny and we can laugh at ourselves around it. But it's like when stereotyping becomes, well, all Aussies are, or all Indians are like that, or all Americans are like that, where we categorize people into one group and usually give them a negative attribute. Yes. Or because we've seen one person from that culture do something, we extrapolate that out to say that everybody from that culture or that nation or that religious background has that. And that's, I think, the area that we've got to stop ourselves from just categorizing everybody in the same group.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I mention one bias which is very harmful?
Yes, please.
There's this bias that if you're talking about serious stuff, like I talk about a pretty serious stuff like domestic violence, and I'm a survivor myself, so, or world peace or things like that. People have this thing that if you are good at something, you have to be very serious. And if you can make jokes around it, maybe you are dumb or something like that. And that's a very harmful bias because you're putting so much pressure. Mental health issues are anyways an epidemic. And when you put pressure on others that, like, am I not supposed to laugh now because I'm talking about domestic violence? Why? And like, I have had this reaction where people like, oh, you're funny. And like, I don't know, but I'm happy. I like being funny. And that does not take anything away from my passion to create awareness about a certain topic. Or take anything away from our intelligence, right, Bron?
Absolutely. And I think it's about that preconceived idea, that judgment, that because a topic is serious, that it has to be dealt with in a serious manner. And that's probably partly why I put that little cartoon up today on LinkedIn, because the world is serious at the moment. You know, here in Melbourne, we're going back into lockdown for another 6
Yes, I
weeks.
heard.
You know, around the world, COVID-19 is having huge impacts, and some days are better than others. I'm sure you feel the same. So we do need light-hearted ways of expressing ourselves. And I think we don't want to make light, because I think there's a difference between making light of a subject
Yes.
that needs to be treated with seriousness, and just having a bit of humour around it, because that is one of the amazing capacities, I think, of human beings, is to be able to find something funny, even in the worst of situations. I think that helps our mental health hugely.
Yes, and once we are off the topic, we have complete right to be, sometimes be just frivolous. That's
Yes,
okay.
that's right. That's right. Well, Ruchi, it has been wonderful talking with you. We have ranged around all sorts of conversations around bias today. It's been just wonderful. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So this has been Bronwyn Williams from Bringing Bias in from the Cold with Ruchi Singh. I'm Bronwyn Williams, a facilitator and commentator on bias and diversity. And this is a series called Bringing Bias in from the Cold. Today, my conversation partner is David Neal. Welcome, David.
How are we going, Bron?
Doing really, really well. David, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a co-director of a company called the Eighth Mile Consulting. My background spreads out across a military leadership experience for 14 years. I was ultimately medically transferred out, and then I moved into the corporate world, where I moved into project management as my primary field of expertise. And then later on, I would go in to create the company with my good friend and business partner, Jonathan Clark. And we've, I guess, built this company on a mantra of good people helping good people. And we're very selective about who we spend time with and who we associate our energy with. And that's why we enjoy being around people like yourself, because ultimately what we do is we try and improve businesses in a very holistic fashion, everything from project management all the way through to risk management and change, all the way through to leadership and resilience. And we'll build customized packages for companies to actually create a solution to their problem.
Oh, wow. Yes, I can see how you and I fit together, and we have had previous conversations and built out a relationship, which is fantastic. And I'm really pleased that you are able to talk with me today around bias. So let's kick off the conversation by getting your definition of bias. And I always say there's no right and wrong answers.
Sure. Well, I typically approach these sort of questions from a high-performing team lens. My background is I did, national level sports in karate, and then I went into army and then worked into very high-performing teams. So I kind of approach it from that angle. And I would say that everyone goes through life and they experience different things. And when they go through that journey, they start picking up patterns, and they start picking up information that they formulate into what they understand to be true. Over time, that becomes very segmented from what another person's experience or another culture's experience may be. And we eventually get to a long way down that journey, and one could safely say that we don't know what we don't know. My experiences have gone so far divergent to someone else's that what I think to be true and right is actually very disaggregated from what someone else's would be. And so my understanding of bias is knowing what those precursors were that led to what my understanding of what true is, and cross-referencing off another person's individual and averaging it out to figure out what the closest thing to true really is. That's kind of the way I approach it.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I want to pick up on 2 points. The first one is about patterns. We love to see the patterns, don't we? I use the phrase connect the dots, and we look
Sure.
back over our lives and we try to connect the dots because we're trying to make sense of what has happened to us, and then the second part, draw some truth out of that for ourselves that we can live by. So given your experiences, which are very different to mine, and I've lived longer than you, so I've got more experiences and more patterns to draw on, what do you see from your own life are some of the patterns that you have found that you then base truth on?
Sure. I like to think about it in terms of the patterns would be where I've invested my time. So, the people you hang around will undoubtedly have a rub-off effect on you, and that will mark your understanding of the world. And I think it's a really important point to bring out the distinction between values and beliefs, because I think beliefs naturally transcribe to our bias. But in recent years, I've had very strong mentors instill an idea that values are far more powerful and a means of building collaboration and rapport and trust, because beliefs can and do change over time, but values largely stay true throughout the duration of our lives. We often get them from our family or, our cultural groups. So to answer your question, I would say my beliefs have changed in terms of patterns because I've hung around different groups, very, very different from each other. And suddenly my beliefs will switch and I'll go, geez, I never thought about it like that. But my values have always remained the same. And, you can actually see a couple of them behind you. I've got service, initiative, and I've got accountability and integrity. And so the patterns I've found that have led to those values seem true for all the groups that I've been around, if that makes sense. My beliefs have changed fundamentally throughout the course of my life.
I found it very interesting as you were making that distinction between beliefs and values, because that gave me some words for an experience of my own, which was when I was on Nauru working with the Salvation Army and asylum seekers. That was where I was first confronted with my biases around racism and white superiority. But what I could see, started to see those things in myself, and they did not align with how I saw myself, because I didn't see myself as racist or really wanted to be somebody who showed superiority. So now I can see, it's just good. Other people give you the words sometimes to make sense of things. My beliefs were the things that had come through to me through childhood and growing up in a largely white monocultural area of Sydney. There were these beliefs around fear of the other, of those who are different to us, and that, white people were superior, they knew best. So they were the beliefs. But my values were that we were all the same, that we were good, that everybody was worthy. So actually my experience on Nauru brought those two things into sharp relief. So my beliefs were over here and I actually saw them. And then I thought, but they're not my values. And that was actually such an eye-opener. It was a bit quite appalling at the time. It was a bit like a body blow when I realised the two didn't match up, but then I could change my beliefs. So I really thank you for that distinction, because I do think we tend to conflate the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say from my own perspective, I'm a director on a charity called Trojans Trek that deals with servicemen and women, military predominantly, but also ex-emergency service personnel who have pretty significant mental injuries, and in some cases are right down the other end of the spectrum. And one of the defining features for people that have experienced mental injuries as a result of their service are what we call moral injuries, in so far that they've done something that's gone against their values. And so we subscribe to an idea that people are not their behaviors. You can't, you can you can at a legal level judge someone on their behaviors, and rightfully we should, because there should be cause and consequence. But at a personal level, people are not their behaviors. They will do erratic and irrational things based on their beliefs at the time.
Yes.
They might believe that that's the right thing to do, but it crosses the line of their values. And they'll look back on that and they will look at it with regret and resentment.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I love that example, because that was what I was wanting to talk with you about next, was about experiences around bias from whatever viewpoint that you're coming at it. So thank you for that. And I like the idea of that you call what we would say a mental health issue, a mental injury. And I think that's a really clear distinction as well, because people are injured mentally. So apart from your work with Trojan trekkers, is that right?
We just call them trekkers,
yeah, that you've had that sort of you could share around bias and how you've had to manage it for yourself, or you've found it thrust upon you and had to deal with it?
I can give you a really gritty one that proved the point to me about bias and its effects. So when I was 22 years old, I was put into Afghanistan for 10 and a half months, combat operations. I came at it from an angle of, I'd only had 22 years experience on this planet. My experience was, I was Caucasian, Irish background, but Australian grown. I went to an all-guys school. I then joined a predominantly male environment. I then deployed on this operation. And so I found it very, very difficult to find a means in order to find rapport with the local populace, both the civilians, the Afghan army, and at times the Taliban themselves. And, Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense through the Vietnam War and through the Cuban Missile Crisis, a very, very intelligent man. In fact, one of the smartest men of the century, gave two key points. And one was empathize with your enemy. And he was referring to the relationship between Khrushchev and Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he also said, rationality alone will not save us. And so these two themes, I was trying to empathize with my enemy, but I found it very, very difficult because we came at it from such different lenses. Yes. So difficult to find common ground, even in an understanding of your enemy at that time, because different expectations on religion, a different source religion, a different understanding of country in and of itself. They don't understand of an Afghanistan as a country, whereas in the Western nation, we identify as Australians. So when you're talking to an Afghan, you're saying, look, we're trying to build an Afghan nation. And they're like, I don't care. I don't even know what that is. What I care about is my village or my valley or my tribal group. And so the context was just so slewed from one way to the other that it was really, really difficult to find rapport. There was behavioral things we could do to match and mirror and build rapport, but it was all surface level. At a very deep level, it's very difficult to find interpersonal relationships that would stand the test of time, because we were literally coming at it from complete polar opposite perspectives of the world.
Yeah. That's
I would say that was fundamental in the way we planned our operations, the way we talked to people, the whole strategic overlook of the operation itself. The 12 years we've been in Afghanistan has come from a completely biased perspective. Imagine if we could have found better common ground and we knew what those biases were before we went in.
That is huge, isn't it? And kudos to you for trying, for starters, because a lot of people don't even try because they're not even aware that they should. They've got their own way of thinking. And I think biases are a bit like blinkers sometimes. They keep us focused in one direction, which can be helpful, but oftentimes just doesn't allow us to see so much more that we could. So to be able to at least, in a sense there, you were becoming aware of your biases. And I say that, you know, awareness is more than 50% of the game. It's when we're unaware and we are unwilling then to even consider that we might have biases. That's when the danger happens.
Absolutely. You've absolutely nailed it. It's, you know, I mentioned it before, you don't know what you don't know. And it speaks to an importance, and we put huge amounts of time into educating people on the importance of objectivity. And it works on a premise that, you know, under a beautiful, you know, glossy world consensus, there is the idea of a truth. You know, there is truths in this world. And if we have a number of different approaches and we average them out, we'll get something that's closer to that truth. And I would argue that you never quite get to truth. It's like nirvana. You'll never quite get there. You get very close sometimes, and data is a great way to do it. But then I would put onto that, data is only as good as the questions you ask, and the questions you ask need to be cross-referenced against other people, because they'll ask different questions in different ways and you'll get very different responses. So data is only as good as the, I guess, the baseline questions that kicked it into gear in the first place. So in the search for truth, the understanding of bias is so important. And, you know, in our team, the way we've tried to address it is by hiring people with fundamentally different approaches to our own. And in doing so, we feel that that's the closest way we can get to diversification of our team, but not from a, you know, a soft wishy-washy perspective, but from a high-performing, functioning perspective. It makes our team more effective. I'll give you, do you want a really good example of this?
I'd love
Bron?
one. Yes, please.
All right. So the other day we were coming up and we were developing a lot of our content for our course. And one of the acronyms had 5 letters that we wanted to turn into a word. It was TAMES, right? Simple task. We're like, oh, we could, you know, someone's like, oh, it's Tames. And then, you know, I've thrown in, oh, it's mates, you know, it's an Australian spin on it. And then we had solidified it. We'd created the content. We'd moved on. And the whole course module at about that point was about forming and building teams. Teams was yes. So my wife's just walking past and she's just like, why don't you just use Teams? I was like, again, right? Our bias and our own slew pulled us into different directions, and the obvious answer was right there. It was someone who wasn't so involved in the problem that had a different perspective that came up with a far better solution. And as it is, it's locked in as mates. I can't change it now. We'll do it for future iterations. But the point was proven, I think, in that particular example. Very, very simple example.
Yeah, look, that is excellent. And I love the fact that you were open to that. And I know she's your wife, and so therefore I would hope you were open to her ideas. But I think that's one of the things about understanding that we are biased and that we have biases. Because when we're able to do that, there's a sense in which we no longer feel we have to, you know, we must protect our positions. Once we become aware that we've got biases, we then actually open ourselves up, and we don't have this defensiveness any longer, or our defensiveness is less anyway about, you know, protecting our position at all costs, because we're actually open to other people's ideas and perspectives.
Very well said. And you would be, you know, you've got your finger on the pulse with a lot of the content that we push out. But there are 2 themes we always push out. One is leadership is not about you. And the second is leave your ego at the door.
Oh, gosh,
and
yes.
for those leaders and those organizations that can pull that off or even get close to it, they absolutely pull away from the pack. And in 2010, there was the British cycling team adopted a new principle called the aggregation of marginal gains. And it spoke to the collective result of 1% increments of improvement across the broad spectrum of one's existence. And so from a professional sporting perspective, it included, washing your hands twice. So you didn't get sick one day less a year, which was 365th improvement on training days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Testing the bike for aerodynamics, making sure our posture was right when we were in rest periods to isolate certain muscle groups, et cetera, et cetera. But it took someone to come at it from a very different perspective to pull the British cycling team into a trophy-winning spot. They ended up with gold within a number of years, and they held the position quite conclusively because of this response. Linking the two together, I would say that bias and understanding that your own perspective on this earth gets you to a certain point. You've got a certain level of knowledge, of experience, and of ideas, and you can be open to new ideas, but essentially it's capped. There is a finite amount of neurons in our brain that allow us to have X amount of memories at any one time. So as a system, we're locked down. At some point, we hit that tolerance. By bringing in totally different people with different systems and different experiences, that idea of the aggregation of marginal gains, that 1% improvement on high-performing teams, and leveraging off the true power of diversity, controlled by very, very controlled leadership and very, very deliberate actions from a leadership perspective, bring it all together to develop like record breakers, the ones that are the top 1% in the world. And they're the ones that are fighting their bias to get ahead of the pack.
Yeah, look, that's a great analogy and idea there about managing incremental change, because all change is just a little bit by little bit. So as we bring our conversation to a close, David, is there one wonderful thought that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Sure. I'd say, referencing back to my point about leaving your ego at the door, I'd like to plant a seed that there is a whole world of truth that you don't know yet. And many of the things that you believe to be true right now, at this exact moment, are categorically wrong. You don't necessarily know what they are. And if you're willing to leave the emotion out of it, and you're willing to get clinical about it, and you genuinely want to know what is true in this world, then you've got a rare opportunity to realign and open the idea that new information might lead you to a different conclusion.
That is a wonderful way to end our conversation. So thank you very much, David Neal. And I'm Bronwyn Williams, and this is Bringing Bias In From the Cold. Welcome to this episode of Bringing Bias In From the Cold. I'm Bronwyn Williams. I'm a commentator and facilitator on bias and diversity. And with me today is Sue Tiong. Welcome, Sue.
Hi, Bron. Thanks for having me today.
It's lovely to talk with you. Sue, can you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Well, I'm a business coach, an international speaker, and my passion is helping startups, entrepreneurs who are just starting out to survive their first 3 years, because statistics show that 9 out of 10 startups fail within the first year. So I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing, because to start a business with a lot of capital or with a little bit capital, the effort is almost the same, because you are starting basically from zero. Even if you buy a new business to start up, it's also the same process. So what I would do is I would sit down with the business owner, the new business owner, or the new business owner, whether or not you have started a business or not before, and we'll work out a system that suits the personality and the behavior of that person, and also we shall see if it's a good fit. And there's no one size fit all solution to it. So that is the diversity of the people that I'm working with, and it's not only restricted to my country, Malaysia, but I have an international clientele, and that's also how I met with Bron.
Yes,
because nowadays there is no limit to the people that we can connect with.
I think that's the most wonderful thing, because Sue and her husband and I met when we randomly sat next to each other. at a conference in the United States a number of years ago. And little did we know that that random seating arrangement would lead to a fantastic friendship. And Sue and I have collaborated on a variety of different projects online, which has just been fantastic. And it's been great for both of us to stay connected and to see where each other's journeys have taken us. So Sue, as you know, I have really moved into the area of bias, and I want to demystify bias, bring it in from the cold, so to speak. So as we talk about bias, what would be a definition you would use around bias?
Well, bias is something that has in my opinion, like the bias that I've been exposed to, at first I thought that it's quite negative, because bias has been present in the society, in schools, in any institutions, even in a family, where you have favoritism and all that. So there's a negative connotation to bias.
Yes.
However, as I grew older, and also in the business setting, sometimes bias is needed to filter off the unwanted. So you make quicker decisions, and it's more efficient as well, because when you already know what you want, there is already a bias in place, because like you already have a set of maybe 5 points, like I need this, 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 and this. So then you straight away narrow it down, and when you make a selection of, let's say you want to hire somebody, there's already a bias. Let's say you want to hire a HR personnel. A HR personnel cannot be somebody who's flamboyant, who likes to go out and have tea to do sales, because that's not the job scope. HR personnel is somebody totally different from a salesperson. So there's already a bias there when you're hiring someone.
Yes.
So sometimes it's quite positive as well, and it's not only negative. It's just that negative sells, bad news really sells. So yeah, so I would say bias is a very neutral way to discern something. Yeah, and it's also like sometimes people do they do confuse bias to discrimination.
Yes.
A certain extent is true, but bias is not discrimination. Discrimination has some form of bias.
Yes.
But it's more to like personal bigotry and all that thing. So I would say that bias, if used correctly, can actually be a tool in the business.
That's excellent, because I loved that word filter, because it makes me think of like something like filter coffee or filtered water, when you're actually wanting to get to a purity. So you're looking for what you really want to look for. And I loved that in terms of your analogy with the HR person. You don't hire someone who just wants to go off and have meetings with cups of tea or whatever. But I loved also that idea of that bias and discrimination are not interchangeable. And I think you're right in that we do interchange those two words. I would add to that, I think discrimination comes out of bias. It's one of the results of bias. And this is where we get to choose what we do with our biases. And I liked the fact that you said that our biases can be used in a positive manner. And I don't know whether I've shared this story with you. I have shared it with a number of people. When I worked with asylum seekers, I came face to face with my own biases around people of different nationalities. And I had this sense of fear around that, not because these people were literally threatening me, but they were different. But what I learned, so I recognized that that was my bias, and that came from largely growing up in white Australia, mixing with people who looked just like me, who thought just like me. And it was part of almost my psychological DNA. But once I was aware of that, I could then choose as to how much of that bias I allowed to influence how I worked with people. And I found that probably that, the bias is now difference I can see now as an asset rather than a threat. And so I think I liked what you said about discrimination, because I think we do too often conflate those two things. And, you know, and it really is, it can be a filter. And that's one of the reasons I want to have these conversations, because when we talk about bias, there's so often a level of judgment attached to that word, you know?
Well, okay. I would say that in the human psyche, when we are growing up, because I have two little kids, the smallest being 3.5 years old only, I do notice that especially in my little one, there is no bias at all when she was smaller, and is all learned from the environment, from the culture, from the upbringing, from the parents, from her friends, from her elder brother. So only then that she started to form her own judgment of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. So I would say it's a very necessary rite of passage for somebody to grow up, because if there's no judgment of what is good and bad, what is right or wrong, then there won't be any like markers, any guideline on how to live your life. But however, the one thing that we can control once we reach maturity is our reaction to what is right or what is wrong.
Yes.
Like, for example, somebody who has already done something wrong, a mistake. Let's not talk about criminal activities, whatever.
No, just
the fact that that you did something wrong. You did something wrong and it cost your business to have a massive loss. Or even if it's just a little loss, okay, just some loss. We don't put a number to it. So what do we do with that? Do we fire that person? But what if we are the business owner who make that mistake? You know, so just because it's a staff member, do we fire that staff member? And if it's us, it's okay. You know, so that is where we can choose our reaction.
Yes.
So I always go by the maxim: if I won't do it to myself or anybody close to me, I won't do it to any other people, because we don't know when the wheel will be turned. When the wheel, we are now at the top, and we may go down to the bottom and top again. So we don't know what goes around comes around. So
yes.
I do have principle in me. Like, I do have that bias. I know it's wrong, but do I say something about it? Yes, I will say something about it. But do I do something back that may have lasting effect, future of that person, you know? So would I do that back to myself, or would I want that to be done back to me?
Yeah.
So that is, I always live by that. Yes, I will still judge whether it's wrong or right, because in business, it's all about good judgments, making good calls.
Yes.
Because if we don't judge in business, then we cannot make a call, you know, like we cannot decide what is good, what is bad for your business. So yes, we do need to have some kind of like a compass, internal compass, that whether or not this serves us. So yes, bias is already in us. We can't say that there's no bias.
Yes.
And yes, we have the bias internally, but when we react, it can be a bias-free reaction. And we consciously make that effort to communicate without bias, or as little bias as possible, and in a very humane and very kind way. So that is the maxim that I live by, that also I try to impart to my clients as well, and also my staff members.
Yeah, that is so true, because I think what happens with bias that we're not aware of, with unconscious bias, is that we often react out of that to a situation, or to something that someone has said, and we do what you've said is not a good thing to do. We treat someone differently than the way we might treat ourselves. We expect more of them, or we speak harshly to them. But when we're aware of what our biases are, we then get a choice as to what we do with them. And we can then choose. And I love that, you know, like there's that whole idea of a, you know, reaction versus a response. And I think bias that is left unattended and unacknowledged, we probably just do reactions. You know, we do the knee jerk, we do the you know, the verbal spray, whatever it might be. But when we are aware of our bias, we can then make an intentional choice about what am I going to do? How am I going to respond to this person? How am I going to respond to this situation? And I know for myself, there are times when I catch myself in a sense, reverting to my bias, you know, reverting to type, and then I pull myself up and go, actually, I don't want to go there. I don't want to operate out of that. And so, you know, I don't beat myself up. I don't take myself to task. I just go, okay, Bron, you've noticed this. How are you going to choose to respond to this situation or this trigger? And I think that's, for me, has been one of the greatest benefits of learning about bias and understanding it in myself, is that I actually then can be much more measured in my response to people.
Yeah, I feel that in this world, we don't talk about age or even the socioeconomic background of people, just us as humans in general, especially in the times of crisis, in organizational crisis or in a worldwide crisis like the COVID-19 right now. We do see the human beings reacting out of fear, out of anxiety. So, and then the decisions they make may not necessarily be a wise one that will bring about positive results, whether or not in business or in homes and all that. And we do see a lot of people panicking, and you have a lot of funny outcomes of that, of toilet papers running out in the stores, especially in Australia. So yeah, so these are actually motivated by the bias inside of them, like, oh no, you know, like there is this very strong holding on to their biases, the personal individual biases. And is very interesting to note the human psychology behind this. And business people, especially those of us who are dealing with the consumers, B2C, it's also very interesting to study the bias in humans, because when we understand that, we will actually be able to reach out to our consumers in a more effective way, I would say. And I'm not playing up on the fear, but we may educate them and do our part in appeasing some of the anxiety in our messaging, and convert them into a more positive crowd. So I would say that is where business people come in. And if we understand biases that way, it will actually, it's actually a tool for us to educate our consumer, the mass consumers, to be actually a well elevated community. So that is where I see where we can use this as a tool.
I completely agree, and that's one of the reasons why I see myself as a commentator on bias, because I think the more that we can talk about it and I can highlight it in the work that I do, because it helps people see it, but see it without judgment. And I suppose I'm using judgment slightly differently to the way you are, because yes, I agree, we need to be able to make judgments in our business and making good decisions. But I'm using judgment in terms of condemnation, you know, where we just go, well, you're wrong, you know, or you shouldn't do that. Whereas I think the more we can talk about the fact that bias exists, and it's actually part of who, you know, part of the fabric of our personalities as people, that we then can see it as a factor that can either limit us or that we can work with. And, you know, obviously, me being me, I'm always about, let's get the best out of this, rather than, you know, just succumbing to the negative impacts of it. So can you think of a situation where you have experienced bias, whether for yourself or in your business, that you could just give us an example from your own sort of life or business experience?
Okay. I would draw on a former client of mine, and there is a lot of negative bias in this situation, because there's really rampant discrimination. So what happened was, I was a consultant for this firm. So we shall not name names here. But what happened was, there is a very strict top-down hierarchy. So the communication was very rigid, and the culture of the company is such that is that the top management has the veto power over anything that the senior management has already on. So you can work on a project, and then you have a lot of meetings, and there's a lot of bouncing the ideas and everything, and then it's already finalized, and suddenly it goes to the top and it can be vetoed down just like that, and all the of work can go down to nothing. And there is also this perception that everybody is stupid, everybody is an idiot, including the senior management. So the top management will just somehow just lash out, like really full on shouting in the meeting room, in the boardroom, because that is the culture. And everybody just accepted that as a norm. And it's like towards the end, they are kind of numb to it. The senior management are just like numb to it. They will just like keep quiet and just let that top management like just rain down on them with expletives and everything. Like, so after a while, it seems like they're just going in the right ear and coming out the left ear. And after that, things are just so I'm like, okay. So in this kind of situation, the receiver of the abuse, this is already abuse. It's not
that's
like,
right.
I won't use a gentle.
So the bias has resulted in abuse.
Yes. So in this situation, the entire organization has accepted this abuse as the culture, as the norm. And when there is an unspoken agreement and an acceptance of what is happening as normal, and they will endure it, that resulted in a very toxic environment where productivity is down, the numbers are down, and that was why they recruited me in the first place, to come in to see what went wrong. So
oh goodness.
Yes. And then I realized in a very thickened environment, it's like the bias is so thick that you could slice a knife out of it. So I was like, okay, so ingrained in them that this is sadly one of the very few cases that I have to say no to after a while. You know that no matter what, you can't change the choices that every entity, every person inside the organization has already adopted as the norm. Who comes in, a voice that comes in will be swatted away like a fly. So that there is a very extreme example of a bias gone wrong. And the company is still surviving, not thriving. So it's just a matter, maybe, I don't know, maybe the coffers can last for like 5-10 years. Good for them. They can retire there, because the people who settle for this job, I do notice there's a trend that it's a dead-end job, and they're very happy to just play that role of the receiver of the abuse and to wait it out. So that is quite common actually. Like, people will settle for something, and the moment you settle for something and you accept that abuse as the receiver and just treat it like it's no big deal. So that is when bias became very detrimental to the future of the company, and even future to the lives of the people involved. So that is that actually.
And that was a bias because you're an outsider coming in with fresh eyes. You could see it, but the people who were there, for them, it was just their natural environment. And you probably wisely chose not to work with that, because it wasn't so much about what the business was or wasn't doing. It was about the culture that had grown out of a particular biased way of dealing with life. But I love what you've talked about before, about how we get to filter things with our biases, how we make choices. And so as we bring this conversation to a close, what's one thing that you could leave our listeners with around bias, how to deal with it, responses, how to use it? Because you've been so positive about being able to use our biases in a really exceptionally good way.
Oh, thanks, Bron. I would say personally, every one of us have biases. So I would invite the audience to go deep within yourselves. When you meet with someone who may not share the same values as you, share the same background, share the same thoughts and minds, bear in mind that variety is what makes life spicier, and
Yes.
also and also the differences is what makes us beautiful.
Yes.
So having met with many people from all over the world with different cultures, different languages, different looks, different age, and different background, I would say that the number one thing that I always hold dear to my heart is, what if this person is my mom? What if this person is my family? What if this person is someone who was born in my family instead of in this family? Would I still love this person? So coming from a point of view of someone who adopted 2 kids who are not from my culture. So,
Yes.
so I had a huge resistance from my family and my community when I first adopted my son, and after that, my daughter. So I have to overcome a lot of resistance. There's a lot of reaction, of course, when I brought the news to my family. And it's just a decision I make, like, what difference does it make if this child come out from my womb, or if this child come from another woman's womb? It's still
Yes.
a baby. So ultimately, it's just a baby. This is just a baby, and it's our bias that we put in, like, oh, it's not mine. It did not come from my flesh, you know. But what does it matter that it's your flesh? It's your bias, you see. So
Yes.
if you can that on that level, on that human level, then, and if every human being can operate from that kind of vibration, that
Yes.
kind of where, then the world will be a better place. And you just look now at with the coronavirus, it doesn't matter what race you are, or even the Prime Minister of England
That's
has
right.
also got so there's no discrimination, you see. So this is I would invite everyone to look deep within and see past all the biases that we may have, and just look at each human being as humans. And
Wonderful.
we are all.
Thank you, Sue Teong. It has been wonderful talking with you. I'm Bronwyn Williams, and this is Bringing Bias in from the Cold.